The Civil War was the most testing crisis that America faced after its independence. The crisis management plan by President Abraham Lincoln was to spend significant share of the federal resources on the most ambitious project in U.S. history: a railroad across an entire continent, through mountains, deserts, and wilderness controlled by tribes and haunted by animals that were the stuff of nightmares. Here's what's remarkable. It just took 6 years to complete the project. Today, the paperwork for a subway extension takes longer. This is the story of how the United States managed to pull off an extraordinary feat during a time of grueling crisis. Early 1860s, the Wild West is open for any adventurers looking for a better life. Making vast wilderness and calling it home was on the to-do list of almost everybody. It was a brief time in history where people who had nothing to lose really could escape to a new reality. Ex-slaves who were now free, Irish and German settlers, Scottish settlers who saw that living on the East Coast was not very different from the life they had escaped in Europe. They did not mind one more migration. However, families had to spend their life savings and sometimes drive themselves into debt to attempt crossing the great American wilderness. Mostly, they would lose their life and dignity. There was a reason it was called the Wild West. Here's how disconnected America was. It was easier to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Reaching London was safer for East Coast Americans than reaching San Francisco. To get from New York to California took 4 to 6 months by wagon train, if you survived. There was no Panama Canal, so the only sea route was literally sailing around Cape Horn, an 18,000-mile journey. This 6-month adventure generally ended up being a misadventure, with storms, disease, and shipwrecks claiming many passengers. Having a railroad that connected the West seemed impossible, but it was necessary. Here are the people that made it possible. Abraham Lincoln. As president during America's bloodiest crisis, he made the audacious decision to finance the future while fighting for the present. While Confederate armies threatened Washington and the Union Treasury bled money, Lincoln supported the impossible railroad across unmapped wilderness. He understood that winning the war meant nothing if California drifted away afterward. Only steel rails could make the United States truly united. Dr. Hartwell Carver, one of the first congressmen to advocate for a railway in America, his vision for calling the project the Great Political and Commercial Artery turned out to be true. Theodore "Crazy" Judah, the engineer everyone said was insane for believing trains could cross the Sierra Nevada. While others saw impenetrable granite walls, Judah identified a specific geological formation, a gradual ridge between river systems. His surveys revealed that trains could ascend the Sierras with grades never exceeding 110 feet per mile, making it technically feasible for steam locomotives. Grenville Dodge, a Union major general who discovered the crucial mountain pass while fighting Native American tribes. In 1865, while on a surveying expedition, he identified Evans Pass, 8,247 feet high, but with manageable grades that would allow a railroad to cross the Continental Divide. These obviously were not the only people who made it possible, but were definitely the most important ones. The Civil War set the perfect stage for the Transcontinental Railway to become a reality. For decades, Congress was deadlocked. The South demanded a southern route through Texas and New Mexico. The North insisted on a northern route through the Upper Territories. Every attempt at compromise failed because each section understood that whoever controlled the Transcontinental Railroad would control the economic development of the entire West. Lincoln had taken office in March 1861, inheriting a nation already fracturing. Then, on April 12, 1861, South Carolina forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, the first shots of the Civil War. This attack on a federal military installation made war inevitable. As southern states seceded from the Union, their senators and representatives walked out of Congress and never returned. By the time the shooting started, the Confederate States had formed their own government in Richmond. They weren't voting in the US Congress anymore. They were fighting against it. The Southern politicians who had blocked Transcontinental Railroad legislation for years were no longer in Washington. By choosing rebellion over legislation, they inadvertently handed Lincoln the political opening he needed. With Southern opposition gone, Lincoln and the remaining Northern congressmen could finally pass the Transcontinental Railroad, making it one of the most important and influential pieces of legislation of all time in U.S. and world history. Abraham Lincoln recognized the strategic necessity immediately. California's gold was funding the Union war effort. The state contributed an estimated $173 million in gold during the first 3.5 years of the war. California had seriously debated independence during the 1850s, with some politicians proposing a Pacific Republic. The state was effectively isolated, connected to the Union only by dangerous overland routes or months-long sea voyages. Lincoln understood that economic integration meant political loyalty. The railroad would make California's prosperity dependent on eastern markets, binding the state to the Union through commercial necessity rather than just political sentiment. On July 1, 1862, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. By this date, the war had already claimed over 100,000 lives. The war would eventually cost 600,000 American lives. The government committed to backing this project with 30-year bonds at 6% annual interest. Consider the financial desperation this represented. The US government was offering 6% interest rates when the Bank of England's base rate was just 3 to 4%. But here's the remarkable part. Despite the risk, they found buyers. The major purchasers were northern banks, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals who believed in Union victory. European investors, particularly German bankers and British financiers, also bought substantial amounts, betting that America would survive and grow. The repayment plan was audacious for a war-torn nation. California's gold mines were producing $50 to $60 million annually. Western silver discoveries promised even more, and the railroad itself would generate massive freight revenues from coast-to-coast trade. The government was essentially betting that connecting the continent would create enough economic growth to pay for itself, that land sales along the railroad route increased tax revenues from new settlements, and the strategic advantage of unified continental markets would generate returns that dwarfed the initial investment. For many great accomplishments Lincoln is remembered, the Pacific Railway Act is probably the most important. The terrain that the railway was built upon was extremely diverse: mountains, plains, fields, desert, and more mountains, with temperatures extreme during the nights and the days. The Great American Desert wasn't just empty, it was actively hostile. Sierra Nevada winters brought 40-foot snowdrifts and minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Desert summers hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit with no water for hundreds of miles. Native American tribes who never got reparations for displacements, if they ever wanted to accept those, attempted multiple times to put a halt to the project. Realizing the railroad meant the end of their way of life, they attacked survey parties and construction crews. The Union Pacific had to work under military protection. Weather that killed, avalanches buried entire work camps. Heat stroke dropped workers daily in the desert. Winter storms trapped crews for months. But they kept building. When winter made mountain work impossible, Central Pacific shipped locomotives by wagon 40 miles ahead to Truckee and started building from both directions. The competition between the companies became legendary. On April 28, 1869, Central Pacific laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single day, a record that still stands today. Think about that for a moment. In 1869, using pickaxes, shovels and wheelbarrows, 8 Irish rail handlers and thousands of Chinese workers laid over 10 miles of railroad track in less than 12 hours. No hydraulic machinery, no computer-guided rail alignment, no GPS surveying. They moved 25,800 railroad ties into position, drove 55,000 iron spikes by hand, and perfectly aligned 3,520 tons of iron rails using manual measurement. Here's what makes it even more remarkable. Modern China, despite building the world's largest high-speed rail network at unprecedented speed, has never attempted to break this 155-year-old record. Chinese construction crews can build elevated highways in days and lay rail through impossible mountain terrain. But they've never tried to beat 10 miles in 24 hours using modern equipment. The economic multiplier effect: the railroad cost approximately $100 million in total construction costs, but generated billions in new agricultural output by 1900, plus billions in mineral wealth extraction. Every dollar invested returned $20 plus over 30 years. Transportation costs dropped 90%. What took 4 to 6 months now took 7 days. California farming became profitable because crops could reach eastern markets. The Great American Desert became America's breadbasket. The technology transfer. Chinese workers didn't just provide labor, they revolutionized American construction techniques. Basket explosives work, precision tunneling, and modular construction methods spread to every major infrastructure project afterward. The network effect. The Transcontinental Railroad sparked 150,000 miles of additional railroad construction. One railroad created an entire national transportation network worth trillions in modern dollars. During World War II, this railroad system moved 8 million soldiers to the Pacific Theater, carried 60% of military equipment, and enabled the West Coast manufacturing that built 5,500 Liberty ships. Here's what's striking about modern America. The United States has forgotten how to build at speed. 1860s America, Transcontinental Railroad, 1,911 miles in 6 years. During a civil war with pickaxes and wheelbarrows, total construction cost approximately $100 million, equivalent to $3 to $4 billion today. Modern America, California, high-speed rail, 500 miles, started 2008, still not finished. Over $100 billion in cost overruns. Big Dig in Boston, 3.5 miles, took 25 years and $22 billion. What changed? Environmental reviews that take decades. Lawyers who file injunctions, politicians who change priorities every election cycle, federal agencies that require approval from 17 different departments, courts that can halt billion-dollar projects over single species of fish or birds. The permitting process alone for modern infrastructure can take 10 to 15 years before construction even begins. The Transcontinental Railroad's entire construction timeline was shorter than today's environmental impact studies. Consider the irony. 1860s America was war-torn, financially desperate, and technologically primitive, yet built faster than modern America with its unprecedented advantages. Today's America has a GDP of $25 trillion versus the 1860s $4 billion, inflation adjusted. The United States has computers, satellite imaging, GPS surveying, and construction equipment that can move in hours what took 1860s workers weeks with shovels. The US has materials science that makes 1860s iron rails look primitive. Modern steel, concrete, and composites could build structures the 1860s couldn't imagine. America has global supply chains that can deliver materials from anywhere on Earth within days, compared to the 6-month journey around Cape Horn. Most importantly, the United States has accumulated capital that dwarfs anything the 1860s could access. The entire Transcontinental Railroad cost less than what America spends on infrastructure in a single quarter today. The US has pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and capital markets worth tens of trillions, resources that make 1860s financing look microscopic. Yet somehow 1860s America, fighting an existential civil war, using hand tools, financing through government bonds at 6% interest rates, completed a transcontinental railroad faster than the modern US can build commuter rail between cities 50 miles apart. The 1860s had legitimate excuses. They were learning as they went, had no precedent for continental construction, faced hostile wilderness, and lost an estimated 150 to 1,200 workers to accidents and disease, casualties the United States rightfully wouldn't accept today. Environmental destruction included clear-cutting entire forests, dumping waste in rivers, and displacing Native American populations, impacts that modern environmental protection laws correctly prevent. But the fundamental question remains: if the United States accounts for necessary modern safety and environmental protections, why do American projects still take 3 to 5 times longer than they should? Why does additional safety and environmental review require decades rather than months? Why do legal challenges drag on for years when the underlying issues could be resolved in weeks? The contrast reveals something troubling about American institutional capacity. The United States has gained the ability to build more safely and sustainably, but somehow lost the ability to build decisively. America has created systems so complex that they defeat their own purposes, environmental reviews so lengthy that they prevent environmentally beneficial projects, safety regulations so bureaucratic that they delay projects that would save lives. The Transcontinental Railroad generation faced genuine existential constraints: limited capital, primitive tools, active warfare. Today's constraints are largely self-imposed, bureaucratic processes designed for risk aversion rather than achievement. The US has optimized for preventing failure rather than enabling success.